Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you to everybody for joining today and for the invitation to speak. I have to say I've done a few of these events for HET ambassadors, and I always find them so enjoyable and so inspiring and motivating. So I was really delighted to be invited back. I'm now going to try and share my screen, which hopefully should work. What I intend to talk about today is just a little bit about the language, the ideas, the kind of political outlook of the modern far right. In some ways, it's very similar to the traditional far right and the kind of ideas you will have been learning about as you study the Holocaust, but in some ways, it's quite different and quite new. And in particular, I want to talk about how the modern far right will latch on to anything that's going on in the world and try and explain it and exploit it for their own political ends and through their own very, very narrow and very twisted worldview. And of course, I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that so far this year, there have been some pretty unusual events going on in the world, some things that a lot of people struggle to explain. And this is where the far right, really like all extremist movements, will come in and offer their particular analysis of what's going on, or just try and hijack or distort events in the world just to try and push their particular ideas. Now, of course, the thing that the whole world has been living through so far this year is the COVID pandemic. I'm going to show you a series of images. I'm going to start off talking about antisemitism, then I'm going to get on to how that relates to broader racist ideas on the far right. There are going to be quite a few offensive images in my presentation, for which I apologize, but I do think it's very difficult to describe them really without showing them. So the first one I want to show you is just, it's a very, I hope that's working for everyone and everyone can see my screen. This is an image that circulated on far-right social media platforms and accounts pretty much as soon as the pandemic started in kind of late January, early February. And it's very in your face. It's COVID-19 at the top. It reads, if you have the bug, give a hug, spread the flu to every Jew. So someone thinks they're being, funny and clever with their rhyming. And at the bottom, the buzzword that a lot of people on the far right came up with, Holocaust, right? And this, I think it's obvious what that's a reference to. Now this image and a lot of other images like it started circulating in far right online spaces when the pandemic began. In the early weeks of the pandemic in this country and in other countries, news stories started appearing reflecting the fact that the pandemic was having a disproportionate impact on the Jewish community, that the number of Jewish people who sadly were dying as a result of COVID-19 was about 3 or 4 times larger than the proportion of the Jewish community in the population as a whole. And there may have been lots of different reasons for this, and it's still not clear exactly why. But anti-Semites, neo-Nazis online, they loved this. They thought this was hilarious. They thought it was brilliant. Jews are dying, let's kill more Jews, right? And this is really a reminder that when we talk about the far right, that core anti-Semitism, that core desire, that joy at the idea of Jewish people being harmed and killed sits right at the heart of neo-Nazi ideology, and they've never lost it. Even if different far-right movements hide it, they've never really lost it. Now, when I talk about far-right online spaces, I'm not normally talking about Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat. I'm talking about platforms, smaller, less common platforms like Gab and 4chan and Telegram that have increasingly become where extremists gather and where they share this kind of material. I'm going to show you quite a bit more material taken from these spaces. Now, the other thing that is absolutely sums up far-right ideology is the idea of a conspiracy theory, the idea that whatever's going on in the world, it's not how it seems. There's some secret power behind it, some secret force. And normally, if you follow this far-right conspiracy theory back to its core, it will always end up blaming Jews for whatever's going on in the world. So this is another image from the platform Gab, from a far-right account. And it has an anti-Semitic caricature of a Jewish person, which is very common that we see in far-right propaganda online. And if you look back at original Nazi propaganda from the 1940s and how Jews were depicted in that propaganda, you'll get the same kind of caricatures. You've got a mixture of different types of racism in the language, where it says it's not Chinese, it's the Jew flu, which was, there was a very strong kind of racist narrative early on that targeted Chinese people, and in this country, hate crimes against people of Chinese appearance or of East Asian origin went up considerably in the first few weeks of the pandemic. But this is saying, no, it's the Jews who are behind it. And if you can read the writing underneath the anti-Semitic caricature, it says COVID-19 gives plausible deniability for their engineered economic collapse. So it's back to this old anti-Semitic idea that Jews either control the economy or want to control the economy. They want to bring it down. They want to bring down society. And the pandemic was just part of that. And we would see different versions of this conspiracy theory. One saying the virus is a hoax. It's all made up to try and bring about this plan. And the other saying the virus is real, but the Jews are exploiting it or using it or spreading it. But it has the same meaning underneath it all, which is ultimately there's something terrible going on in the world, something people don't understand that's really turned the whole world upside down. And who's behind it? It's the Jews behind it. And that is just this common conspiracy theory that we see whatever is that's going on. Here's another image, which is a little bit more subtle and abstract, but if we deconstruct it, you have the story of the Trojan horse, which I'm sure you're all familiar with from Greek mythology, the idea that the virus is the Trojan horse, and in the belly of the horse being sneaked in is, again, that anti-Semitic caricature of the Jew who wants to control the world, and that's the image of the globe. And then you have, in this image, the idea of kind of good, wholesome, healthy white people being tricked into bringing Jews in or helping Jews spread their influence because of the virus, right? And that's the meaning of this. And again, this is something that's circulated on a lot of far-right message boards. And it's just one example of how far-right actors will just grab hold of whatever's going on, whatever's in the news, whatever people are thinking about, and try and piggyback on it. Now, I said these images were on these far-right platforms. These kind of far-right spaces, and far-right accounts on places like Gab and Telegram and so on are absolutely full of anti-Semitic propaganda, violent, even terrorist anti-Semitic propaganda. Images like this, images calling on people to kill Jews, to burn down synagogues. These are just three images that we at CST have found, but there are many more. Here's a whole load more, right? And all these images I'm showing you, they are literally just scratching the surface. Some of the language is extremely offensive, both racist and violent and anti-Semitic. And if you look at the images, in terms of the actual design, they're very, very eye-catching. They're very slick. They're the kind of thing that just work online as memes or as posts. They will grab attention. And they have very strong, clear images portrayed in, just 2 or 3 colors and very, very slick slogans. This is just a tiny fraction of the kind of stuff that circulates online every single day in far-right online spaces. Alongside videos, these are just a handful of thousands of videos from an alternative video sharing site called Bitchutes, which is kind of works exactly like YouTube, but basically anything goes. You can post any kind of racist, violent, anti-Semitic or terrorist content, and unless the police call them up and tell them to remove it, they won't remove it. It will just stay up there. This was, you may have seen an article about this in The Observer on Sunday about this website. Now, alongside this, and if you look at some of this, some of the material in these videos will come directly from Nazi propaganda. I think the one on the top right, as you look at it, is from original Nazi propaganda, and others will be more modern images, but it's the same kind of message about how Jews are evil and run the media and so on, all to try and destroy, bring down society. Now, alongside this kind of very obvious anti-Semitic imagery, you'll get broader racist ideas. I want to talk a little bit about how the antisemitism connects to broader far-right racism. One of the dominant conspiracy theories on the modern far-right today is called the Great Replacement theory. And this theory argues that immigration, multiculturalism, and diversity in Western societies are part of a plot, a Jewish plot, to destroy the white race, to commit genocide on the white race and bring down white Western societies. And it's called the Great Replacement, the idea that the Jews are plotting to replace white people with minorities and people of color. Now, the image on the left saying the Great Replacement towards a new society was a manifesto written by a far-right, a neo-Nazi terrorist called Brenton Tarrant, who murdered 51 people in 2 mosques in Christchurch in 2019, in March 2019, which I'm sure you may well remember. This was the name of the manifesto he posted online on one of these social media sites before he went and did his attack. The image on the right is an image that is posted very, very frequently, particularly I think on 4chan, but on lots of these sites, listing a whole load of Jewish organizations and synagogues in Britain who work with refugees, who work with refugee charities. And the image is claiming that Jews are using refugees or promoting asylum, again, to try and attack and undermine the white race. Wake up before it's too late. I mean, this is as close to incitement as you can get, but it's part of this conspiracy theory that merges racism against minorities, prejudice against refugees, and anti-Semitism, all wrapped up in a big conspiracy theory. And this has real world consequences. Sorry, one other thing I want to show you, and again, I apologize for the really offensive, violent language here. Also, as well as this racism and anti-Semitism, is a hatred of society, right? These are images, again, from these sites, encouraging people to kill police officers, to bring down, to bring about chaos in society as a whole, to bring down kind of the structures of the social order, and to do it through violence. So this is a revolutionary movement that we're looking at when we look at the modern far right. And it's also a global movement, and it's a movement where these images move from offline to online. The image on your left, as you look at it, is an image created online, posted on the Telegram site. You know, it's a figure in a Nazi uniform with a gun. It's got blood spattered with the name of a far-right movement called Führerkrieg Division. This is the name that is used in lots of different countries. Somebody in this country printed off this, downloaded this image, turned it into a poster, printed it off, and stuck it on walls in Birmingham last November. Right now, I doubt very much that anyone told these people to do it. They weren't acting under orders from the leaders of Führerkrieg Division or anything like that. This was just an example of how this is a totally global movement. It's a kind of a grassroots networked movement. All these resources are online, and people anywhere in the world are reading them, getting encouraged by them, spreading them to other people online, and even taking them offline. And of course, the ultimate expression, the climax of this offline activism, is the terrorism we've seen from the far right over the last couple of years, where neo-Nazis have gone into mosques and synagogues in Christchurch, Pittsburgh, San Diego, and in Halle in Germany over the last 18 months and murdered Muslims and Jews at prayer, or in the case of Halle, murdered a passerby and someone in a local kebab shop. This is real world terrorism. Now, all 4 of the people who did this They either posted their intentions to do it online on social media first, or they posted a manifesto explaining why they were going to do it, or more horrifically, they videoed themselves doing it with a body camera, live streamed the video on social media, and then that video got captured and downloaded and recirculated. And so on these sites, what we see is the videos of the attacks in Christchurch, the attacks in Halle and others, reposted and watched tens of thousands of times by other people as a way of encouraging more and more of this kind of terrorism. And this is the far right ecosystem now. This is where the far right lives and operates, excuse me, and encourages each other to carry out these kind of attacks. And when people carry out these kind of attacks, they become heroes. The person on the left in this image is Thomas Merritt, who is the neo-Nazi terrorist who murdered Joe Cox MP in 2016. The person on the right is Robert Bowers, who murdered 11 people in a synagogue in Pittsburgh in October 2018. The messages are very, very explicit. You know, Thomas Merritt saw it as his duty to murder an MP. And the implication is, are you going to do your duty? Are you going to do what I did? But sometimes I think some of the most shocking images we see and the messaging, the incitement that we see are the ones that don't have all the kind of the blood imagery and the violent imagery. And these are two images that really stuck with me when in kind of the research we do at CST. The man on the left is Robert Bowers, as I just mentioned. He was the terrorist who murdered 11 people at the synagogue in Pittsburgh. The man on the right is John Earnest. He murdered one person at a synagogue in San Diego last year. And as you can see, there's a Nike tick, there's a Nike slogan, just do it. There's like a cool advertising, marketing slogan, believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. Neither of these images say who these people are or what they did. There's no anti-Semitism explicitly. There's no mention of Jews. There's no guns. There's no violent imagery, nothing. But the people on the far right platforms who see this, they know who these people are, right? And this kind of messaging, they understand what it's saying. It's saying, go and do it, sacrifice everything. And if you do, if you carry out an attack, then the people who do those attacks will become the heroes for this movement, and they will get memes and images created about them. They will become immortalized in this kind of imagery. Now, one of the reasons these images really stuck with me is because on these same platforms, after the killing of George Floyd in America by American police officers, what we saw was this image on the left, the same image, right? The image of George Floyd being killed. We've blurred George Floyd from that picture, but it's the same image, same message. It's the same people doing this. The people encouraging people online to kill Jews are the people celebrating the murder of a black man in America. And then it's the same platforms where they're posting images like the one on the right, calling for race war. These are people who love violence, they love division, they love what's going on at the moment, and they want to encourage more of it. And then alongside this racism, they come back to the same idea of who's to blame, who's behind it, who is it who's dividing America and setting people against each other. It's the Jew, right? And whenever we look at the far right, historically or in the present day, and we look at the racist incitement, the racist violence, it always comes with this conspiracy theory about who's pulling the strings behind it. And of course, that takes us back all the way back to original Nazi propaganda and Nazi ideology that lay behind the Holocaust and that was used as the justification for Holocaust. And I think it's the way that very old traditional far right ideas and language and even images gets reused, reinvented, and applied to everything that's going on in our very modern world and transmitted through the most modern, up-to-date social media methods that anyone is using. is the way the far right tries to stay relevant and tries to spread its influence. Thank you for listening to me.
Hi everybody. Really, real pleasure to be here. And HET is an organisation that I have a huge amount of respect for, and particularly the Ambassador Scheme. So thank you very much for having me. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to give you loads of graphic images like Dave did. So I am going to talk about some unpleasant stuff, but possibly like take it back into where you might encounter this in your lives, slightly less than the real, really toxic stuff that we've just looked at, which is obviously really harrowing. I also just want to say that thank you to Jerry and Jemma. Jerry, you talked specifically about how the far right preys on those who lack opportunity, which is spot on. And Jemma, you spoke about your sister and how she hadn't been able to engage with some misinformation. And those are two things that I'm going to be covering now. So thank you to both of you. I felt like you kind of had a sort of like looking over my shoulder this morning when I was writing what I was going to say today. So thank you. So I'm going to just share my screen now too. Okay. How's that? Let me just pull that over here. No, what can you see?
Yeah, we can see your PowerPoint.
Perfect. Okay, for some reason my PowerPoint's on my wrong screen. Oh, now it's okay. Cool. Okay, got it. Okay, so just to review a couple of things that Dave spoke about. Should we try and make this into an actual PowerPoint presentation? Nope. Okay.
Yeah, that's perfect for us.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Fine. All right. Okay. So just a couple of things. So the first one is just as Dave was saying, when we think about the far right now, I think a lot of people still think in terms of organisations like the BNP and the EDL. Things have really moved on. Those organisations are tiny now, probably smaller than they've ever been. And what we're talking about nowadays is that the far right is very post-organisational. So that's where we're talking about, as Dave was saying, a lot of the stuff happening online and individual actors who aren't necessarily being told by a leader, but are gaining their inspiration from each other. Online, what's happening also is a lot of incitement, and a lot of encouragement, and a lot of celebration. So something that happens, you know, in Australia can be being incited by somebody in Germany or in the UK or in the United States. If someone in one of these online spaces is saying, I'm feeling really angry and I'm feeling like I might want to, that person will get huge encouragement online internationally from people who are like-minded. So that, and there's a lot of kind of so even when things are happening live, there will be live celebration and there will be live encouragement of go and kill more people. The word rape is used not just to mean sexual violence, although that's also a massive part of what goes on in these kind of chats and the way that people talk. But rape is used as a shocking word to talk about any kind of violence as well as sexual violence. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of those things, just to kind of build on more from what Dave was saying, possibly like not always connected to anti-Semitism, but all that kind of real toxicity and the want and desire to shock as much as possible and use as many toxic ideas as you can. But of course, what I also want to touch on is that, you know, while some of the stuff we've just seen from Dave is perhaps the crocodile, there's also a swamp. So if somebody is really, really actively involved in the far right, there's usually a reason for that. And I want to talk about a bit of what's got somebody to that place, what's the toxic environment that they've experienced that's got them to that place, and perhaps why people like you and me can make a difference, how we can make a difference, how we can spot it, how can people help people step away. So yeah, back to what Jerry was saying at the beginning, in terms of who would be most likely to get actively involved in the far right. So white men, almost all of the people involved in the far right, particularly in terms of actually perpetrators of violence, would be men. They would be people who've come from a place with real limited opportunity, both economically, very educationally left behind, usually having very, very low level of education. They'd be socially vulnerable, and I kind of put that in like that because it can mean lots of things, different things for different people. It can mean that they've grown up in a really toxic situation at home themselves, or a very vulnerable home environment. It can mean that they don't have great social skills. They could be either on the spectrum or just somebody who finds it very difficult to make friends. So for some of these people, these far-right groups are a way to feel a sense of belonging that they've not felt anywhere else. And while it's difficult to, necessarily diagnose situations of autism and stuff, there is some evidence that there's an unusually high number of autistic people attracted to the far right. Obviously, that 100% doesn't mean that anybody autistic is vulnerable to join the far right. It's just that if you are anyway experiencing all the other things that I've mentioned in terms of lack of opportunity and not having that social support, that's just an extra vulnerability that might be in there. The other thing to say in terms of the far right and becoming actively involved and we've had experience with people that we work with to get out of the far right, it's very easy to get in. It's much, much harder to get out. Where there are small cells in real life, like, for example, National Action was, our mole in National Action, Robbie, has told us firsthand that, it's very easy to get in and get involved, but it was very, very difficult to leave because your life is at risk. You've exposed yourself to a small group of very violent people, and you know all their names and where they live. They don't want you to leave because what you know about them is too dangerous. So just some sort of key ideas to spot, which might be sort of either leading to identifying with far-right ideas, or things which are kind of like, if you want to use the word slippery slope. So we can see some kind of linking themes which come up strongly. So not everybody will share all of these ideas, but these ideas are all ideas which come in strongly. So one idea is feeling a sense that you can't have a sense of pride in your national identity without being called a racist. Now, in multicultural Britain, I think we can all feel pride in being British and understand that as meaning that Britain is a diverse country that we celebrate. But if you're coming from a sense of you are a white outsider to that multiculturalism, then you feel that your sense of national identity is under threat. So you'll hear these expressions like, you can't say anything nowadays with fear of being racist, it's PC gone mad, I just want to be proud to be British, and all this multiculturalism isn't allowing me to be there. So it's that kind of sense of language that people are using. Anti-feminism is a huge idea which is very, very strong in this kind of like the swamp from within which the far right comes. And when we talk about anti-feminism, we're talking about kind of using language like feminism has gone too far. It's meant that there's not enough space for men to be men anymore. Feminism doesn't allow me to express my male identity, and I'm losing my rights as a man because of feminism. And this really sadly is very, very strong in 16 to 24-year-olds nowadays. There's actually it's a growing trend, even relative to the next age cohort up. So whereas you might consider that the younger a group of people is in Britain, the more socially liberal they are, that's generally the case. But there's a growing group in the UK of young people who are really strongly anti-feminist. And in our education work that we do in schools, we see it in the classroom all the time. In schools, students tend to be able to self-regulate when it comes to racism. They know what's acceptable to say, even if they don't believe it. But when it comes to misogyny, it's a bit open season. And actually, we can use that to our advantage sometimes in terms of setting up students to kind of recognize prejudice, because they will say stuff which will expose prejudice they didn't know they had, which in a way, in terms of racism, they would self-regulate and it wouldn't come out in a workshop. But it's very worrying because it's definitely a slip road to other ideas, because once it gets linked into ideas about liberal elites taking away our rights as men, then you go down the conspiracy theory, because who are their liberal elites and what's their agenda, discrimination against white people, and also a growing comfort with the idea, or feeling comfortable with the idea, that political violence is sometimes necessary. So whereas I would never think that however passionate I was about something, political violence would be a solution for there's a growing solid group of people who think that actually if I can't get what I want, I need to use violence. And you can see that, for example, in the football hooligans and the anti-Black Lives Matter demonstrations, that they didn't feel they had a voice, so they came to London to have a fight. Okay, so moving on to sort of conspiracy theories, which are hugely, hugely important in terms of generating a culture of being able to access difficult ideas and being able to take on far-right opinions. So I think Dave touched on this a bit, but the underlying idea behind any kind of conspiracy theory is that if you think that it doesn't really matter how innocuous it is, if you think that Princess Diana was died, there's something dodgy about that. If you think the moon landings were faked, you've got to peel that back and say, but why? Who had an agenda to do that? Now, a lot of the time, the agenda behind conspiracy theories, when you peel it back, is anti-Semitism. It is that idea of puppet masters. Doesn't have to be anti-Semitic. Some people who are talking about Cabal are talking about, for example, Bill Gates. So it's not always anti-Semitic, but it is a centuries-old anti-Semitic trope. And most times in the far right, when you peel it back, it is about this idea that there's a secret group of Jews who are trying to control the world. What feeds into that is partly the fact that these young men are not accessing mainstream information, and they're not trusting mainstream information or figures of authority, and they are spending a lot of time on YouTube, particularly accessing far-right and alt-right figures, Tommy Robinson, Paul Joseph Watson, InfoWars. So that's where they're getting their information from, which is conspiratorial in the first place, and it just grows the conspiratorial mindset to the point that you might have gone in thinking the moon landings were faked and trying to find out a bit more about that, and you end up in full-on anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Okay, so question is what we do really in our social circles, in the people we encounter, in how, if we know all this stuff is out there, and most of us I'm sure don't want to go to those kind of websites that show those awful images that Dave was showing us, what can we do in a day-to-day way that can make a difference? So I suppose as individuals, we can always diversify the information we consume ourselves. Doesn't matter whether you're left-wing or right-wing or couldn't care less, it's always a really good idea to read multiple different news outlets and get that kind of balance and read opinions that you don't agree with, whether that's politically or in other ways, because it just gives you that diversity of opinion, and it also gives you a bit of like ability to balance yourself and to argue those thoughts through in your head, but also that when something comes up that you may kind of know where that's come from. The second thing we can do is challenge disinformation. On my next slide, I'll go through ways to do that. And the next thing I would say is all about having open conversations. So we go back to Jemma's sister. So how do you have those conversations when you know a friend or family member or somebody on university course, somebody you work with says something and you just think it's a bit not okay? How do you talk to them about that without losing a friendship, without creating a really toxic environment, without having an argument that you're not prepared to have, especially if you're not 100% sure of the full kind of the full perspective on what it is they're talking about. You're just not comfortable with what it is they've said, whether it's a racist joke, whether it's something that like sounds a bit borderline, you know, whether it's sort of talking. A good example would be somebody, I mean, 1 in 5 young people thinks that the Holocaust was exaggerated. What would you do if someone sort of mentioned that in passing? And I think a really good tip is not to go straight in there going, no, you're wrong, because then automatically you're putting them on the defense and they're going to just double down and defend what they're saying. Ask people why they think that. How, you know, what is it? That's interesting that you say that. Where did you hear it from? Why do you feel like that? What's happened in your life that's made you get to the point where that was something that was interesting to you? Do you know anybody Jewish? Have you, you know, I thought what you said was a bit challenging as a woman. what would you feel like if somebody said that about your sister? So trying to have those kind of very open conversations. I'd say that the final thing on this is to always stay safe, particularly if you're interested in online conversations, making sure that people can't find out, especially if you're speaking to strangers or engaging with strangers, making sure your settings are safe so nobody can find out where you live, where you're posting from. Make sure your locations are set to off if you're posting photos. Make sure that your friend settings on Facebook are shut so that people can't just access everything you're putting up there. I'm just going to go to this infographic that we put out actually for the Great Get Together last weekend on things to do about online misinformation, which is obviously a mammoth issue right now. So the first thing is, how do we stop ourselves making a mistake? So if something comes in to one of your feeds and it makes you really cross, pause. Don't share it straight away. Somebody might be trying to exploit your anger. Don't immediately trust your eyes. It's very easy to manipulate video or photos or to use footage out of context. Check who else is reporting that story. If you can't find it on any mainstream news outlets, it might be because it's not true. Look into the messenger. If you don't know who the person is who sent it, double check who they are and what their politics are before believing what they're saying. If there's very wild maths in there, huge numbers, check them out. They might be inaccurate. Often they're used to hype things up and mislead. So all of these five bullet points are actually on our charity website with a little bit more detail about what to do. But I think this, I'm guessing that I can circulate this around or maybe take a screenshot, because I think this is a really useful graphic also to share on with other people to say, I've been thinking about misinformation and thought this was useful. So going back to if you've got friends who's sharing stuff that you're thinking just doesn't ring true to me. So this is some stuff that we do a lot of. We're not the only people doing this, and I think the UN is actually launching a big online misinformation, digital misinformation campaign tomorrow. So watch out for social media for that. There's a lot more of this happening now, but unfortunately we're still swimming against the tide. The far right is way ahead of anybody trying to stop the far right in terms of the way they're using digital platforms. So we are trying to, stick our finger in the dam, but there's just so much out there that it's kind of a bit of a losing battle, but it's about being savvy in the things you do, staying safe while you do it, and just doing your bit to make a difference. The other thing you can do, follow CST, and I'm sure that Dave will share his details for that. These are all Hope Not Hate feeds, which are worth following to stay informed as well. That's really it for me. I'd really like to move to questions.